So the approach I developed, the Resilience Toolkit, is really, it has several goals. And one of the goals is to help people develop a mindful awareness of their stress. We frame it around stress. I don't even use the word trauma because most people can't even use the word trauma. It's so traumatizing to them. They're just like, no, that's somebody else. Because when you're in the middle of surviving, it's hard to admit how bad it is. And so to help them develop this embodied awareness of what does it feel like in my body? What does it feel like in my mind? What does it feel like emotionally? How am I with other people as I become more stressed and as I relax? And then to frame that in, is that adaptive in the moment? Is that adaptive for you in the moment? Which helps restore some sense of agency around evaluating, wait a second, my body is reacting in a way that's really good for me right now, or it's not good for me. And so there becomes this choice point comes out for many people who haven't had a lot of choices. And then from there to choose, if they find that their stress response is not adaptive in the moment, to choose from a menu of very short mindfulness and movement tools. Very short. This is not a retreat model. These are people who can't, what retreat from what? This is, they are in it. This is, they need something in the moment that, and my rule of thumb is if it doesn't downshift you in about 30 seconds, next, go to the next. So that they're using these tools for a specific purpose, as opposed to, you know, in a Buddhist tradition where we're saying it's about spiritual liberation, or this is not about that. But it's not, while it's secularized, it's not, I've cut off the roots, the Buddhist roots for the mindfulness. I have not left it free floating as you would find on an app, right? A free floating breathing or mindfulness app. I've recontextualized it in a different framework. And so this toolkit framework is then to say, okay, if you using these tools, figuring out how do you know that they're working for you, which again grows their mindfulness, but at the same time, their self-agency. This is working for me, great. This is how I know, or this is not working for me, I can stop. Again, very few places in your life where you can say, I'm uncomfortable and I can stop. For people with marginalized identities, with people with oppressed identities, that is revolutionary to say, I don't like this and I want to stop, because the culture doesn't allow us to have preferences. And so in that way, and then we use some behavior change theory to help root these into practices into life. So that's the framework that I use. And so what might that look like? So for these girls, right, we met weekly throughout a semester. And I distinctly remember, you know, at the beginning, some very disengaged, checked out folks. I remember one girl using I'll say that. There was one session where what we would do is we would do a practice and they would kind of share during their week, what were they observing in themselves and what was functional and what was non-functional. And one girl said she had to relate a story about how their family dog was sick and they didn't have money to go to the vet. And this was, you know, a very dear animal to her. And I'm thinking, oh God, right? And she said, you know what though? I think I over-responded. My response was too strong. I think I could have used whatever the practice was she liked. I think I could have used it more and taken care of myself a little bit better there. I was like, wow. And then the next girl shared, she has a 1-year-old living in a hotel on a voucher because she's homeless, and her baby's teething and crying, and she's really worried she's going to be kicked out by the manager. And this is not a nice hotel. And she realized, she says, you know, I'm in shutdown, I'm in freeze. And she says, I think I need to be here. And everyone affirmed, yeah, that sounds like where you need to be to get through. So her numbness, we could validate her numbness, and it became not just it was almost a mindful numbness, if I want to say, but protective. That one actually, we had an outside evaluator on the program, and she's one who said she didn't really like any of the practices, but she showed the most growth and resilience, which I thought was interesting. And here's another one. So here's a young girl who I remember doing a particular practice, and you could see her visibly settle and relax. And she sat up and she says, "Oh, I don't like that one at all." And I'm thinking, I watched her settle. And she said, "I feel too relaxed." I said, "Okay." I said, "Yeah, that's good that you know feeling that relaxed isn't good for you and probably not safe. Probably staying on guard has kept you safe, and you know what you need." Left it at that. Okay. Repeated, coming in week after week and practicing, dipping her toes in, practicing. And she went from pretty much of a numb shutdown state to being really like, she'd leave and she was bouncing. Like if that school had a track team and she could run and use that energy, you could see what was locked inside of her was being liberated. And then about 6 weeks into the program, she then comes forward and says that she's actually, her cousin is her perpetrator and lives with them. And she was able to say it and to get intervention and to get moved to a safer location. So what happened here? Her response to be vigilant was truly keeping her safe. So our insistence that you always be calm, that people should always be grounded, that people should be feeling everything, right, would set her up for more harm. So trusting to work in collaboration with people that they can determine, right, with some awareness about where they need to be. But she was so in a shutdown, right, that in fact, it turns out she was probably over-responding a bit to her situation. And by having moments where she could drop down into relative safety, she started to get some of her agency back, and some of that freeze was liberated, and some of that sense of movement came back, and she could reach out and ask for help. Because some of the dangers in mindfulness, the way it's proffered, is that this is only an individual situation and that the person needs to settle themselves, and that's it. It's not them, right? The source of her angst was outside of her and her suffering. And if we talk about, not all things are okay. So her ability to sit with suffering, this girl doesn't need to learn how to sit with more suffering. This girl needs to learn that suffering is not her lot in the world. So her mindfulness becomes a tool for liberation, not to accept more suffering. And so being really careful when we talk about being mindful and non-attached when there's in conditions of oppression. When there's conditions of oppression, about how much people can feel, how safe it feels to feel that. And when they start to feel that, and not to locate all of the problems within ourselves, that some of the problems truly lie outside of ourselves, but we, how do we get the capacity to make changes around that? This morning I did a session for a group for a foundation with the London office, and for people of color in this office. So they're in London and in the EU. And we were talking about vigilance, right? As they were becoming aware in the teachings of their nervous systems and how vigilant they were. And one woman said, she's Muslim, wears hijab, and says, "This is the reality for me. I'm racially profiled. It is not safe for me. I need to be vigilant everywhere. And someone from my community goes somewhere and has a bad experience because of our identity, then I too am vigilant wherever they have been, and it spreads, and we are vigilant." And I was trying to make the case about over-responding, and she's like, "I don't think this is an over-response. I think this is a protective response." And it keeps her numb to a certain degree. And I said that the key here is we're here in front of this Zoom. You're not in any of those places. And we've done some practices and you felt some settling. So that means, I'm not saying no response, but do you think maybe you're 20% over responding? 10%, 30? Are there times when you could settle and you're not, and dropping into some feeling? And all of a sudden it clicked. Oh, yes, right? There are places where I am probably could drop down a little bit and wouldn't be so harmful to me. And she had, as we were closing the session, she became quite sad, quite heavy. And she says, I'm feeling just so much grief. Grief about, I mean, this is an organization that internationally does a huge amount of heavy political organizing. Most of them on this call were lawyers to human rights, just really heavy lifting across the global south. And she says, we are politically active, we're ideas, thoughts, we're doing advocacy and all of this work. And we have neglected the body element. And I'm thinking about all the oppressed people on this globe and what is happening to our bodies, the suffering in our bodies. Like, it had not occurred to her at that level. So we sat with that for a moment, all of us, and also said, and this is also, think about all the amazing work that you've done so far without considering your body. What happens when your body is part of the consideration? Right? What does that unlock for us? What kind of potential is there? It's a neglected resource. But still navigating this tension between how safe, how much privilege do I have to feel? How safe, how much privilege do I have to feel? When I drop into feel, how much is there to feel? Can I handle it? Will it overwhelm my system? Will it shut me down? How to titrate that in ways that I can not become overwhelmed and stay present enough and work towards liberation. I call it the resilience toolkit. A lot of the word resilience, I think, can have some ugly connotations the way it's used. It's often used to people who are the most resilient, and we're telling them they need to be more resilient. We use the word resilience in Western culture to absolve systems of their responsibility in the suffering of people and say, you just need to be more resilient to the system, instead of tasking the systems to be more kind and compassionate and nurturing and not producing so much adversity in the first place. So I'm very cautious of the use of the word resilience, but I still think it's a good word. I think it brings up this idea of flexible strength, where we bend and we don't break. It's not strength for strength's sake and only pushing and only that hard part. Because when we push and only push, that is actually, we become less resilient, we become more brittle, more rigid. We exhaust ourselves always pushing. There's a sense of resilience is knowing when it's safe. Like I long have said, resilience is knowing when it's safe enough to rest and resting effectively. And that rest might be a 10% rest, but it's a 10% rest. Knowing when you can drop down a little bit. That ability helps us build this kind of resilience where we're not always pushing, where we know when we need to rest, where we have this flexibility. So it's more than bouncing back from adversity. It's more than even a post-traumatic growth where we learn more about ourselves and find strength and resources within and outside of us that help us improve or be better. I like to use a term we call it alchemical resilience. And this is this idea that we build this reservoir, this big, big, wide lake of flexible strength, this capacity. And we use that capacity to change the conditions of adversity. We use that capacity to change the conditions of adversity to a system that doesn't demand so much resilience. It's nice to have, but that you shouldn't have to always be digging into that pot. And like, there's some people who will argue like we shouldn't have privilege, right? So it'll be, I mean, we have privilege. We have all different kinds of privileges. Question, privilege is essentially a capacity. What do you do with it? What do you do with it? I think a lot of good can happen out of it. But acknowledging it. And so I see this as putting this framework of mindfulness in service of liberation. And not just from the constraints of oppressive systems, but also what other kinds of liberation is that? The liberation, like oppressive systems really rob people with marginalized identities, especially of capacities to feel joy and pleasure. Who's allowed to have joy? Who's allowed to have rest? Who's allowed to have pleasure? Whose pleasure is pathologized? Hey, you're poor people. You shouldn't be buying something nice for yourself. Go work, go save. Hey, what are you doing? And so to restore that too is really important. And we have to be, to have space to feel those too. So I think that that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it.